Flying. It is the ultimate expression of freedom. An idea that the invisible tethers that hold us to this earth are just another problem for humanity to overcome. Many of us dream of the concept of rising above the clouds, completely unrestrained by the forces of gravity. And yet, while this is a fantasy that many of us share, the act of doing so in the real world is easier said than done. Yeah, unless you're lucky enough to have spawned into this world with a pair of wings, or just so happen to be born as a sentient, infinitely respawning balloon, then I'm afraid that the only way your ass is touching the clouds is by taking the sky bus itself, airplanes, and using those to get to the destination of your choice. Just be careful, last time I did that I ended up stuck in Omaha, Nebraska. But hey, at least they had a ton of steakhouses and an aquarium that doubles as a zoo. Speaking of Midwestern darlings, there is someone who embodies the concept of taking off to the skies better than anyone else. That, of course, is DC's own Firestorm, particularly the Jason Rush version. But since I don't see him getting a movie anytime soon, there is that Superman guy we can always talk about. Yes, while we here in the real world still have a few years to go before we can achieve self-sustaining flight, the lucky folks over in the world of fiction have been making this impossible feat their reality for hundreds of years. So in anticipation for the Big Blue Boy Scouts' latest upcoming big screen outing, that being James Gunn's Superman, I thought it'd be fun to look back on the guy's signature form of mobility and how it came to be, along with the efforts that were taken to make audiences back home really believe a man could fly. So, let's discuss. The act of making a dude look like they can take off in the air through their will alone is nothing new. I mean, mythological characters have been making this happen for as long as humans have looked at birds and thought, why do they get to have all the fun? Thus, you get stories like angels, gods, and dumbasses like Icarus who couldn't follow one simple rule, but more recent examples include Peter Pan, Dumbo, and the Wicked Witch of the West. Though she did admittedly use a broom, but let me see you do something with that thing other than sweep up that mess you made on your carpet. In all seriousness, I do want to see someone make a flying broom. Get on that, Gravity Industries. But while we wait for those content creators with supposedly genius-level intellects to figure out how to free us from the shackles of one of the most prominent forces in the known universe, let's talk about something a little more suited to my subnormal intelligence, and that is understanding why flying is so difficult of a visual effect to pull off. As I pointed out earlier, we as humans just don't have the ability to take off from the ground at a whim. Or at least, it's a hat trick I've yet to see anyone pull off. So the only way someone is going to manage to commit this act to screen is through clever trickery. Over the years, many different techniques have been utilized in order to get boots off the ground. From wire works, which is essentially hoisting some poor schmo up into the air, to blue and green screen effects where the background is keyed out and replaced with a new location, to even completely replacing the actor with a digital double. Tricks like these have evolved as technologies improved over the years, as well as each filmmaker iterating on what came before. Though the issue with this is that there aren't really a lot of examples to pull from. At least not compared to when you look at the vast majority of stories being told. Yeah, having your characters essentially magically fly around isn't a concept a lot of storytellers have to contend with. However, there is one character archetype where this is the exception, and that is none other than superheroes. Now, the first superhero to ever achieve this feat is none other than Namor the Submariner. I know, crazy, right? The guy whose whole thing is ruling over the ocean like he's some kind of a aquatic man. Anyways, this Speedo-wearing pointy-eared jackass is actually the first costume crusader to hit the skies. Yeah, those little wings on his ankles aren't just for show. I'm sure many of you could have sworn that a certain last son of Krypton would be the one holding the mantle of first hero to ever fly. And I'll bet there are even a bunch of you saying that he even debuted a year before Namor in Action Comics issue 1. And yes, it is true, Namor's first appearance was in the Motion Pictures Funny Weekly #1 in April of 1939, a whole year after the Man of Steel would debut. However, when Superman's first stories were being released, he hadn't yet been given all of his notable abilities. After all, this was during the early years where writers were still trying to figure out whether or not these things could even turn a profit. So not all of the most recognizable elements of the character had been fully ironed out. Meaning rather than flying around like a bird or a plane, Superman would just sort of jump wherever he needed to go like he was the Hulk or a roided up Kangaroo Jack. Hence why in his stories they specified that he can leap tall buildings in a single bound. I mean, why else would they point out that a guy who could fly could also do that? I mean, kinda comes with the territory, wouldn't you think? It wasn't until the Superman radio series, alongside with the Max Fleischer animated shorts in the early 40s, did this staple of the character get introduced. Though for the animated series, this was mostly done to save time, since despite being over 80 years old, these cartoons were actually incredibly detailed. A lot of work went into making them. And so they would take whatever shortcuts they could, just to get the damn things released. And it turns out, flying is much easier to animate than jumping. Though they hadn't fully committed to this, which is why you see them sometimes going back and forth as to whether or not this is his main mode of transportation. As for the radio series, this would actually introduce a lot of elements of Superman's mythology, most notably his weakness to kryptonite, though this is a discussion for another day. Anyways, come the time we started seeing a live-action depiction of the character, this key ability had become a standard part of Superman's arsenal. And as a result of his overwhelming popularity, it was inevitable that he was going to get a live-action interpretation. Though, there is something of a hurdle that comes with adapting a character like Superman that isn't present with others looking to make the leap from page to screen. It's one thing when you're adapting the character from comics to cartoons, but in live action, there is a limitation to what you can accomplish based on just the fact that you're working with flesh and blood actors rather than animated figures. And since Superman's abilities are a key aspect of his character, in order to do him justice, you're gonna have to find a way to portray them. And flying is a particularly difficult effect to pull off. Not just because, as people, we can't do that, necessitating the need for a lot of behind-the-scenes movie magic trickery, but also the very concept of someone moving through the air, supported by nothing but their will alone, is inherently goofy. Like, don't get me wrong, you can make flying look cool, but you're gonna have to put some work into it. Obviously, the idea of flying is cool. The Wright brothers were able to figure that out back in the day, and they didn't even have the internet. But when actually committing the action to screen, utilizing flesh and blood actors, it is all too easy to elicit the wrong reaction from your audience, replacing wonder and awe with laughter and ridicule. A huge part of comedy is making fun of what we consider normal. And what's more normal than gravity? The literal force that holds our reality together. The very act of defying it is defying normalcy. This is all a long-winded way of me saying, it's very easy to look goofy when you're trying to make a character fly. It also doesn't help much if your effects aren't very good. But a good VFX team can solve that problem for you. And when it comes down to Superman, he needs all the help he can get. Being one of the very first characters to fly on screen, directors have been using a variety of different tactics to get this man off the ground. His first live-action depiction was in 1948 in the series simply titled Superman. Since this was both a TV show and in the early days of cinema, the effects were much more limited. But they did find a way to commit this amazing ability to screen, namely by replacing the actor Kirk Allen with a 2D animated double for key shots where he'd be flying across the screen. Though even this effect was used pretty sparingly, they mostly just had the guy running around wherever he would go. I won't fault this show too much, based on the fact that this is the first time that Superman had been done in live action to begin with, so you can forgive the difficulty in overcoming some of these growing pains. Next up was the 1951 Adventures of Superman, starring George Reeves in the titular role. Much like Kirk Allen before him, his Superman was also saddled with the special effects limitations of his time, though with this go-around, the team had visual effects expert Bullseye Simonson to help give this production a bit of a leg up. At first, the team would try to use wires to lift Reeves off the ground, though this would lead to some incidents and minor injuries for the actor, thus necessitating the invention of this unique device called the pan, which would suspend Reeves in the air while giving him a bit more mobility and freedom, and best of all, better selling the illusion. This, along with the basic chroma keying effect to simulate whatever background they wanted in post-production, allowed for this at the time incredibly convincing effect that still in part holds up to this day. Unfortunately, the whole thing was pretty exhausting, but since they were filming these scenes separate from the rest of the production, then that meant they could front load as many as they needed and splice them in throughout the show. To help further sell the effect, they'd also use a dive board in order to give the character the appearance that they were taking off, as well as using ladders and swings to make it look like he was coming in for a landing. As you can see, a lot of work went into figuring out how to make this effect possible, and I think the results really speak for themselves. Up next is the man who many to this day consider to be the best Superman. No, I'm not talking about Nicolas Cage. I refuse to count whatever monstrosity the Flash gave us, but rather Christopher Reeve. Not to be confused with George Reeves, who, come to think of it, were also dragged into that monstrosity of a Flash movie. Though unlike Cage and his uncanny appearance, these two guys kind of had a bit of a necromancy situation going on, and kind of both of them were deceased. Let's just get away from this topic altogether. It's upsetting me. What are we talking about again? Oh yeah, 1978's Superman the Movie, directed by Richard Donner. Now up to this point, Superman had only appeared in TV shows and extended specials. But now with Christopher Reeve, the team's mission was not just to make the man appear to fly, but to erase any doubt that he ever could. This was so crucial that the tagline of the film was literally, "You will believe a man can fly." And again, this is before the CGI era where you could just drop him into Adobe After Effects. So the creative supervisor and director of special effects, Colin Chilvers, and the team had to put their thinking caps on. Some earlier ideas involved an actor skydiving out of a plane and filming their descent, while hiding the parachute under the cape. Because, otherwise you'd only get one take. They also flirted with the idea of making a Superman mannequin and firing it out of a cannon, though this offered very little room for control once he was in the air. So despite all their brainstorming stopping short of strapping the actor Christopher Reeve to a rocket, they ultimately decided to go with the tried and true method of sticking him on wires, using a mechanical arm, along with blue screen compositing and rear projection. Unfortunately, even this would come with its fair share of problems, namely in the fact that blue screens were going to be a bit of an issue considering the character was kind of wearing a big blue costume, and the way that chroma keying works, you need to have the subject in the foreground be a completely different color from the background, allowing you to completely separate the subject from the background and then place them into whatever location you desire. So in order to work around this, Reeve would be provided with a different colored suit while he was on the blue screen. And then once the effect was complete, they do some color grading trickery to make the costume look consistent with how it appeared throughout the rest of the film. Another member of the VFX team, Zoran Perisic, would put together a process in which the rear projection was linked to the camera, so that when zooming in, it would give the illusion that Superman was flying towards the audience. Altogether, the team was able to craft a look that, while not always perfect, was revolutionary for the time, and would go on to inspire future productions for years to come. And in Superman's case, outside of Christopher Reeve, the remainder of his live-action appearances in the 20th century would be relegated to the small screen in the form of the Superboy series and Lois and Clark: The New Adventures of Superman, both of which would continue to put the actor on wires, as well as using blue screen compositing. Lois and Clark would also do a few creative things like rotating the set like they did in the Inception movie or in The Amazing Spider-Man 2, giving him the illusion that he's walking up a wall. But the main method that most productions would stick with moving forward was the tried and true blue and green screens, as well as suspending the guy through wire work. And by the 21st century, they pretty much had this effect down to a science. And moving forward, filmmakers would no longer be content with just convincing you that a man can fly, but instead, they wanted to do their part in not just making you see it, but feel it. Because unfortunately, for as good as the prior attempts were, at the end of the day, they were still building the road as they walked it. Especially in the case of the first movie, where it was very clear they were still figuring things out as they went along, with only a handful of perspectives that aren't just him going from one side of the screen to the other, and even then these are few and far between. The wire work, while invisible to the naked eye, can at times feel a little bit silted, feeling less like Superman's in control of his actions, and more like he's traveling along a predetermined path. Which obviously he was.
No
But future adaptations would build on what came before in order to help you forget that. So come the early 2000s, filmmakers would do more to make it seem like Superman's actions were actually having an impact on the environment he was in, which helped sell the effect even further. Shows like Smallville, when they were given the opportunity to play with this power, would attempt this almost ripple-like effect on the air around Clark, similar to what they did in The Matrix when Neo would take to the skies. This would also be accompanied by some slow-mo, dust and debris being kicked up and pushed back, sound effects, the camera rumbling, going a long way to sell the idea that not only was he taking flight, but he was taking off. It would then devolve into either locked camera shots of him flying across the screen, as either a colored smear or a vaguely detailed character model. Though when they went to a close-up, the result was something similar to what we're seeing in the new movie, placing him on his chest and having the scene sort of roll around him. Many a times they would even end it with having him fly off away into the distance as the camera struggles to keep him in center frame. But back to the movies, the sequel to the Richard Donner-directed Superman films, Superman Returns, would adopt a more modern approach for the era it was released in, combining the tried and true men-on-wires act in front of a green screen with using the newly available 3D models built using CGI. The issue with this, though, is because of the era it was made in, the model really doesn't hold up upon scrutiny. And unfortunately, the way they used it, there was a lot of times that this Polar Express reject was the center of the frame. And to be honest, computer-generated people haven't come much farther than this in the modern day. So this trick still has a habit of standing out when films continue to use it. Eventually though, we would reach what I consider to be the apex of flying in Superman movies, that being Man of Steel. Yeah, I might have my problems with this movie, but the effects are not one of them. And the way they achieved this was once again a mixture of CGI and green screen wire work. Because even though computers can't really replicate people, environments, and luckily capes are well within its wheelhouse. You see, a little detail I didn't mention before is that the cape goes a long way to selling this effect. Flapping in the wind, this little piece of cloth is really helpful in determining where your character is moving based on the fundamental forces acting upon it. As we all know, the faster you move, the more resistance you encounter. And since for the most part Superman is wearing tights, aside from his hair, the cape is the only thing that's going to show this resistance. And the material they choose to go with for the cape, when it's not completely computer generated, is a lot softer and more flexible, making the moments that it's blowing in the wind very visible. This stands in contrast to the cape used in Superman Returns, which is a lot heavier and harder to get a read on. I understand that back then it was hard to render these sort of things, but it doesn't change the fact that there are many times that this thing just looks like some big red blob on the back of his neck, instead of the crimson curtain it usually is.
Doth mother know you weareth her drapes?
The team would also once again make a big show of his taking off, this time foregoing the ripple effect from Smallville in favor of this almost gravitational field he generates, levitating a bunch of dust and debris as it slowly encircles him, and then seeing the ground shatter as he rockets towards the stars. The film heavily relies on the speed he travels at. Very rarely is he just soaring calmly from one location to another. No, in Man of Steel, Superman's constantly hauling ass. Breaking the sound barrier on a whim, this man is no bird or plane, he's more akin to a fighter jet or a heat-seeking missile. I do feel that the movie relies a little too much on the chaos of it all, but if your goal is to make Superman's flying badass, then yeah, the crazier the better. And this remained consistent throughout his tenure in the DCEU. Though we didn't see very much of it because the character of Superman, at least the Henry Cavill version, was used quite sparingly. But that brings us quite nicely to the modern day. The last live-action Superman we've had has been Tyler Hoechlin's Superman in the Supergirl series, alongside his own self-contained show, Superman and Lois. And luckily, with all the years of experience filmmakers have had with flying characters, they were able to consolidate this into a TV budget, allowing for near movie-level quality VFX. The show has also helped that, based on what I've seen, the entire team is extremely dedicated to this character, all doing their part to make this CW show look as cinematic as any big-budget blockbuster. But with the show coming to an end, the stage is set for James Gunn to make his mark on the character, with David Corenswet starring in the titular role. And that's a brief overview as to where we find ourselves landing today. The history of how Superman has taken flight is one that I find endlessly fascinating, with filmmakers for over 80 years contributing their creativity and problem-solving skills to get this character both figuratively and literally off the ground. And now we're only weeks away from seeing him fly across our screens once again. And after everything we've learned, I hope we can appreciate the film a bit more, just knowing where one of the most iconic abilities this character has originally came from, as well as the people along the way that helped bring it to life. Superman is the face of all superheroes, with a rich history filled with changes and revitalizations, while still maintaining the same fundamental framework. It's so cool to see how different creative teams have depicted this guy in one way or another. And with over 10 years between now and the last time he's had a solo film in 2013, I just look forward to seeing him back up in the sky. And fingers crossed he won't crash and burn like last time, because oh god, I just looked at the budget on this film, and holy shit, they gotta make a lot of money for this thing to break even.